This conference is now being recorded.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the New York State ASBO webinar, Effective Management Techniques. My name is Matthew Darius. I'm the Senior Staff Associate for Professional Development here at ASBO, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. Your speaker for today's program is Jeff Olefson from Staff Development Associates. Operator assistance is available at any time during this conference by pressing £0. Questions for Jeff may be asked at any time by pressing £7 on your phone. You may send chat questions at any time by using the chat window located to the right of the main screen. I will now turn over a call to our speaker. Jeff, please begin.
Okay, I got it now. How is everybody today? I see we got a bunch of people here. What we're going to look at is some issues around how you supervise staff effectively. And then there'll be a bit of a follow-up in next week's webinar on some additional techniques and strategies. So let me start at the beginning by saying that in my conversations with my colleagues in industry, the prevailing view these days is the best thing to do is to hire the right people the first time out. You know, there's the expression is garbage in, garbage out. And so this notion of fixing people, that's not something that's generally the view. Do a lot on the hiring side. But one thing that we definitely learned in working in the public sector is that you often don't have that luxury. Frequently, you're going to have much less control over who you have in your staff and have a much greater challenge in trying to remove people, even if you wanted to do that. So I think the general view is we have to work with people, we have to try to improve them, or we have to live with it. And unfortunately, I think in so many cases, people try to live with it. And so I would say in my experience, probably one of the biggest challenges I see is just a general low expectation. So I'll give you some examples of low expectations. One is the very notion of a job description. I'm sure some of you have heard someone say, I don't want to do that, that's not in my job description, or that's not my job, not part of my job function. Well, think about the notion of a job description. It essentially is a list of entry-level skills for a job. So, minimum standards. So if somebody's been on the job for 20 years, it's true that these are the minimum standards, but this notion that they should only have to do what's in their job description explicitly written is really a ridiculous notion. It's kind of this idea is you're only as good as you are at the time we hire you. There's no expectation that you're going to grow on the job. Now, I'm not suggesting that a lot of people don't grow on the job. Most people do. But I think that you're going to have some prevailing view among some employees of wasn't hired for that change took place, I don't have to do it. And if you accept that notion, then of course you're going to end up with people having limited capacities. I'll give you one more example of this. Just recently, I and a colleague, we just finished doing an efficiency study in a district that was out of state, so I feel comfortable sharing with you a little bit about it without getting into the details of what district. But in this district, one of the things that we looked at was the business office and functions. And to our surprise, well, not entirely to our surprise, but what we saw was, in the case of one employee, they clearly were underperforming their job in terms of tasks. There were a lot of things that should have appropriately, actually it was a payroll person, should have appropriately fallen under the person, but were ending up being done by other people in the business office. Now, we could easily surmise what happened. This person probably wasn't very good at this or complained about it, so of course these things need to get done, so someone else assumed the responsibility for those tasks. So the end result was it kind of generated this notion of, well, this person, it's as good as they get, it's good as it gets. And I see that more often than not the case. Now, I understand that people do have limitations and you do have to work with what you have, but at the same time, I think sometimes we don't push hard enough. And if in the process of pushing, that hastens someone's decision that this is the wrong job for them, I'm fine with that, provided we do that in a respectful way. But I think you got to look at some issue about whether or not historically within the setting you've come into or where you are, there hasn't been this notion of, well, this is all these people can do, and this is their limitations, they don't like computers, they don't work well with people, etc. And I think that's something that we need to, not accept as a notion. So one of the things that I often ask people to do when I do training on holding staff accountable is to think about what their wish list is. If you could wish your employees would be the way you would want them to be, what would that look like? So what I'm going to ask everybody to do is, on a piece of paper, and I assume everybody has a piece of paper, I'd like you to take maybe a minute. Maybe I'll hum to you while we give you the minute, but take a minute or two out and write down maybe 2, 3, or 4 things that you wish your people would do. Okay, so I'm going to go silent for a few minutes. We don't have any background music, but I'll give you time to do that. Okay, well, I hope everybody's had enough time to jot down a few ideas, vent their spleen a little bit about the things they wish they could have with employees. Let me start with just a general premise, which is, this is an old saying, but it's really important to think about, is if you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there. And I have to tell you that even in your encounter with an employee on an individual day, you really need to make sure that before you talk to that employee, you really know what it is you want to ask them to do or not to do, and you want that to be something that they're going to understand. And in some ways, that has to really be tied to what your goals are for your department, and even this idea of having a notion of a goals. So what I often find is that people just assume that follow my lead will work. And I don't think that that's the case. I think you need to have definable goals and objectives that are clearly communicated to your team. And so I often will ask you, and these are reflective questions, because that's what training is really all about, is what are your goals for your department for this year? What things do you want to ask your people to do by virtue of the fact that they've had another year of experience? What are some things that you think are weak spots in your operation that you really need to improve? And are those goals really understood by your staff? Or are you simply reacting to situations that arise, a complaint from someone or a problem that arises? And so really the key is to have goals. And so it's often a question, by the way, that I ask people in training. I'll ask them, what's the goal for your department? And if I get a kind of a little looking at their shoes or deer in their headlights look, I often realize that they haven't been spending enough time really thinking about this. So I think that's the first step. It's certainly not everything, but to think about what some of your goals are. What would you really like to see your people be better at or do better? And then beyond that, knowing where you want to go is kind of the easy part. I had someone once say this to me. I was doing some work with the City of New York, and it was the Department of Homeless Services, and the commissioner made a comment to us that really stuck to me. He says, knowing where you want to go is the easy part. He says the end game's the easy part. The hard part is figuring out what are the next steps. Because in a sense, in understanding the next step, you have to really do a thoughtful assessment of current practices. What are people's limitations? How far can I take them? What's their skill level? So I would say, it's how do you really decide what those next steps are? And what most leaders tell me is, especially new people, is I really thought people were more with me or more ready than I imagined. So I introduced a new system, and all of a sudden I realized people's skills were weak. And I think that's fine. So, yes, you do sometimes have to take a step back to step forward, but I think it's important to think about that as you move forward, because ultimately if you're going to supervise, you're going to have to think about what it is you're going to really ask people to do. Something else that I just would like to give you as a thought, everything that happens has a reason. And I was just talking about this last week. I was doing some training in central New York for a district. And I was kind of sharing my own insights as somebody who's been doing training for a lot of years. And I would kind of share it with you this way. If you come into a school, this is usually a larger group than a small department, but if I come into a school and I encounter one difficult person or, one resistant person, that's about the person. But if I come into a department or I come into a school and everybody is difficult or resistant, My conclusion is that's really a function of the way they were led in the past. That, leadership really does matter, and that if people are reluctant to accept or embrace change, or they don't team or they don't collaborate, it's usually something that's a function of the way they were managed in the past. Some managers managed by divide and conquer, and now you try to create a collaborative team, and everybody's very suspicious. So if in your attempts to improve employees, you experience what you think are kind of strange or odd behaviors or paradoxical responses, I would suggest that you look a little further, and invariably you're going to find out that had something to do with the history of the way these people were led in the past. Now, the other thing to consider is that all improvement is incremental, and that everybody can get better, including you. And one thing that often troubles me as well is I see situations in which people get a good evaluation, and there's no discussion about how they can grow. Everybody can grow. You can grow. So I think it's important. In fact, sometimes you can maximize your benefits more by trying to work on building on the strengths of your strongest employees than on your weakest. Not that I'm suggesting you should accept poor performance on the part of weak employees, but some kind of a notion of, okay, you're good, so we don't really need to work on you, we're only going to focus on the poor performers, is not really how you maximize your operation. So think about the notion of things are in small steps, but you need to know what those steps, you need to think about how those steps fit into the bigger picture. And that's why it's important to have a plan, and it starts with some, simple ideas. One is standards and expectations. What are the standards when, a phone call comes in? I'm obviously, I'm not exactly sure, obviously, because we haven't talked as a group about what some of your backgrounds are in terms of who you supervise. But, for example, let's just the simplest terms, I assume everybody's involved in supervising a business office, are there standards about turnaround time if someone makes a request, whether it's a vendor or it's a staff member? Are there reasonable expectations about turnaround for work? And obviously nothing is perfect, but the fact that there is a standard that people can say, I'm meeting that standard, or I'm kind of falling short of that standard, that's important. You need to have those standards. People need to know about them. And then you need to look at and analyze work responsibilities. One of the things, again, that we found in our recent studies, we've been doing a few of them, is sometimes people at a higher level in the scale, the management scale, I should say the administrative scale, doing lower level work. So we had people with the title administrative assistant being paid a higher salary, and yet when you really took a look at their work, they were really doing work that would have been considered really clerk's work. And then you need to really have a plan for each position. What is it that you want to try to do in terms of growing that position? And by the way, the simplest thing to think about, because we don't want to make things crazy, is the notion of cross-training. One of the things that scares me often in some of the business offices that I've visited is to the extent to which there's such rigid stratification of job functions that if someone is sick, it creates a real problem for the department, or the SBO has to chime in to do the work, as opposed to thinking long-term about cross-training. I'll just share with you a Japanese notion. One of the things that they say that's different about the United States versus Japan in terms of how they manage is in Japan they see employees as an asset. And in the U.S., we tend to see employees as an expense. And this is really important. If you see employees as an asset, then you want to maximize the value of that asset. And the way they see doing that is by making sure that people are as flexible in their skills, an ability to function in multiple functions. So, for example, it's common in Japan to train employees on multiple job functions within the scope of the normal job. Here in the U.S., the tendency is to hire for a person for a position, only provide them training for what they actually have to do. So there's no sense of having this. We have this flexibility built in as an asset to your operation. So that certainly could be an area that you could look at if that's not a function. One of the things that we made in our recent, our last efficiency study recommendation was cross-training accounts payable clerks and payroll clerks. So that, again, if someone were ill, they could spell each other, or if one was having a particularly hectic time in the cycle, they could assist And that's, again, that might be an area to look at. Certainly not the only area, but it's an area to look at in terms of what might be your goals for your operation, and then what might be the basis for your conversation during annual review and on an ongoing basis. And here again, I think as a leader, it's really your job to create the optimal climate for teaming. The notion that people are going to team automatically is not at all the case. One of the best ways to get people to team is to some extent, to make them work together on things. And what I've often found is the natural tendency is to create very rigid stratification, and that may have some benefits in terms of accountability, but weakens your ability to each cover for each other. So that may be an area, again, that you want to look at in terms of your goals. So whatever area those are, whatever you feel is, you have to look at your operation, decide what you really think the need is. But I think clearly there's always some room for improvement. I've never seen an operation that we could say is so perfect that it doesn't need to have goals. And actually, people are very motivated by goals. It's something for them to work for, achieve for, celebrate as a success. So something you need to look at. And again, I kind of had said this before, I think it's important to emphasize a stellar evaluation doesn't mean that there's no room for improvement. You know, great performing employees need job enrichment in order to feel motivated. And it's interesting, sometimes handing someone a project to work on, letting them do something that you used to do, or that, you know, is really kind of would typically fall under your purview, often is a sign, it can create great fulfillment for the individual. And so I think one of the things I always recommend is when you do your evaluation, say to an employee, here's the projects I'd like you to work on. In fact, I just talked to one district recently, and this is kind of a concept, but the concept is that 90% of your job is your job, whatever your function is. And 10% is the extras. Or, to put it another way, the 10% is something beyond your job. It may be serving on a committee for the district, could be working on a special project, could be assisting with something that typically might not fit in the job description. You know, the job description is accurate there. Doesn't fit within what they might perceive as the normal job. And, you know, we've often heard people saying, that's not my job. So we introduced the notion of that everybody has to work on something that isn't their job. Now, interestingly enough, what you're going to find is that frequently a lot of your best performing employees, in fact, have a 10% anyway. They've always offered to be involved in something, and they're doing it anyway. So it may be a way of introducing this concept to all of your employees. But think of it as an interesting notion for a meeting. Say, my expectation is that 90% of what you do will be your regular job, and then 10% of your time will be on some sort of special opportunity. And when we talk to employees, what we hear frequently is that that's the source of the most sublime satisfaction, is this extra special opportunity. Not to mention that it's resume building. If you talk to people who've really moved up, started in the ranks and moved up, frequently it'll be because a boss gave them an opportunity to do something that was a little bit beyond. So think about that notion, that it's just built in, that when you have an evaluation, even if it's a good one, we'll talk about what we want you to work on, by virtue of the fact that you now have another year's experience. By the way, just another interesting notion to kind of fill this in. You know, we pay people steps, which some people have said is you get paid to breathe. Okay, you know, you survive another year, you get more money. Well, I would suggest to you, you know, we often don't explain why someone with another year really should make more money, as opposed to it just being in the contract. I would like to suggest to you that that there is a reason to pay them more money, that there is some value in their experience, and that the presumption is that as you're on the job longer, you've learned more, you're able to do more. And I want to be clear on that. It doesn't necessarily mean more work, because a person can only do so much work. But it may mean that they're now ready to do better work. So I'll give you an example. If you have a secretary and they're inexperienced, you may ask them to type a letter. If they're a little bit more experienced, you may ask them to take a previous letter. Let's say it's a letter out to a vendor. Take a previous letter and change it and edit it to make it, you know, a current letter, and then you would review that. If they're a really experienced person, you might turn around to them and simply ask them to draft the letter. So that's something that can come over time, where a person can now take on more responsibilities by the virtue of the fact that they know more, they've learned more. So we need to think about how to really kind of build that into the culture. That, you know, when it's time for your evaluation, you're gonna have an opportunity to learn some new things and to take on some new challenges. I already talked about cross-training, but I would suggest to you that's an area, again, not to over-labor the point, that I see as a weak spot in a lot of schools. I don't see enough emphasis placed on cross-training. And it's true in industry as well, but especially I see it more in schools. So, of course, as we do all of these things, inevitably the question that comes up is, how do I address my poor-performing employees? How do I really, you know, what skills can I do in terms of addressing concerns that I have? And so what I'm going to do is I take you through some abbreviated version of training that I do. I've done actually all over the country on how you hold staff accountable for performance, and that will probably run most of our time. But before I do that, I'm actually going to stop and see if anybody has any questions.
If you have a question for Jeff, please hit 7# on your phone.
I guess we don't have a lot of questions. Okay. I think it's the culture of webinars that people tend to do more listening than asking. But I'm actually gonna kind of stoke this a little bit more. I had asked you in the beginning to think about some things you wish your employees would do. What would be your wish list? So if anybody would like to share maybe one or two of them, I would appreciate that.
If you want to share with Jeff, please hit 7# on your phone.
Or they can also chat, right? They can
yeah, you can chat, or you can talk to you, Jeff, right in person on the phone.
Okay, I guess I'm going to have to work harder than I thought today, but that's fine.
Jeff, we have a question or a comment from Darren.
Okay.
His comment is, stay out of each other's personal business.
Okay. That's an interesting one. Yes. Anybody else? Well, that was one of the comments, right? You wish. Let me just make a general thing about, you can wish anything. And the way I framed the question in a way kind of was a little bit loaded. It wasn't qualified enough. There are a lot of things that I may wish employees do, but I need to think about what I really can ask them to do or not to do. Now, I would certainly say that, and you have to frame it in terms of what you can do or can't do. In fact, I'll kind of lay it out in terms of 3 basic stages, okay? You can ask someone to do something or not to do something that they're going to understand and that you can monitor. Now, it seems to me that when somebody says stay out of each other's business, the way I would interpret that is that people are probably, lots of times I hear that in terms of people complaining, this one doesn't work as hard as I do, et cetera. And I would certainly say that it's okay for you to say to an employee, you need to really focus on your work. That has really nothing to do with you. If you have that much time to look at that, maybe you don't have enough work. But as we go on, I think I'll give you some more examples of that. Anybody else? They say nature abhors dead air, so I'm going to move on, okay? All right. So I think, again, the important thing to think about is what you can ask an employee. And I often find that, and it's funny, I find it more with in particular when people deal with educators, this kind of reluctance to be really direct, So someone will say something like, don't you think that as a motivated employee, dedicated employee, you should do this? or they'll pose, they'll do like an inquiry. They'll say to the employee, how do you think you should have handled that situation with a student? And I have to tell you, I don't think that's really very effective. I think the most important thing is to be assertive in your communication and to get right to the point. And so if you have a concern, I think you need to say, this concerns me, I need you to do this. In the future, I need you to do this, or if this were to happen again, I wish you would do this. So I think, again, before you have a meeting with them, always a good idea, by the way, don't have a meeting with someone when you're very upset. Usually, unless they're about to burn down the building or cause a lawsuit, you can usually wait. It's a good idea to be calm. It's a good idea to think about what it is you want to ask the employee to do or not to do, and then we'll talk about how to do that. But I always recommend having a bullet list. You make a list of 1, 2, or 3 things. You look at it. You say, is this something the employee is going to understand? Is this something I can keep track of? And then we'll talk about how you can communicate that. But that's a first step. That's interesting. If you're going to look at this issue, and obviously we're talking about how to address a concern you have with an employee. So this is a communication issue. And so if we're going to look at the issue of communication, we have to look at the different styles of communication in the context of supervision. And so I'm going to take probably about, I'd say probably about 20 minutes or so and take you through some various styles. And obviously, I'll tell you from the onset, I'm aiming for one in particular. In fact, if you see the little graphic there, I put a little picture of Goldilocks and the 3 bears. And so I often like to say this is a good example of what this is about. You know, in the story of Goldilocks and the 3 bears, there were 3 bowls of porridge. One was too hot, one was too cold, and one was just right. And that's what we're looking for. We're looking for that just right, okay? But in order to be able to understand that, you need to look at the other types. So let me kind of go through hostile and passive with you, and then we'll get to assertive. So let's start with hostile. So what are hostile communicators like? Well, here's a couple of basic things about them. They tend to focus on the person rather than the attribute. So they'll start out with a preamble like, what's the matter with you? I mean, I'm being a little extreme. I'm not suggesting that people would normally do this to an employee, but clearly, well, actually the first example of hostile, the most common example of hostile, is to yell and scream. And I can certainly tell you in my early career working as an accountant for a public accounting firm, that wasn't all that unusual to have a partner yell and scream at a junior accountant. But I would say generally speaking in the public sector, and I would even say now in the private sector, that's just not considered socially acceptable, you know. So people don't do it, because if they do it, they usually face the wrath of upper management. But that doesn't necessarily mean that people can't be hostile. You don't have to yell and scream to be hostile. In fact, the really key to being hostile is that you're focusing on the person, that there's some kind of a personal attack involved. So something like, what's the matter, you don't have a brain? Or you didn't, what's the one I hear a lot? You weren't really going to do that, were you? Those are the kind of things that are hostile. So, in fact, I would certainly say biting sarcasm, subtle innuendo, anything that turns the knife would be an example of hostile. And I have to tell you, some of the people that do this, they enjoy it. They find it rather self-stimulating, you know, the turn of the phrase, criticizing someone, but it's not effective, and we're going to talk about why it's not effective in a minute. So I think most people would understand, the doer of that would understand that that's hostile, but I want to also talk about a type of hostile that I think many people don't even realize is hostile. Now, normally when I do this in person, I'll pick someone as a victim, you know, so we'll have to try to simulate this here in a webinar, but I'll usually pick someone as a victim, and I'll point my finger at them, and I'll do the following, and I'll just show you. And well, actually, you know what? It doesn't even matter if I point a finger at them. Even if I do this in the calmest way, I would suggest to you that this is hostile. And so, and here's how it works. So suppose that I had an issue with an employee who had a pattern of being late, you know, late a lot. So I turn around to the employee and I say the following. You were late 16 times in January, 18 times in February, 20 times in March. You were a little bit better in April. It was only 12 times. and I simply run the list. Now, I see teachers doing this with students as well. I kind of have a term when I do it with teachers I call running the roll book, but it's basically where you're just going over a long list of prior transgressions done calmly, factually. I would suggest that that's hostile. Now, it's very interesting. Often when I do this as a workshop when people can raise their hand, I'll often ask people how many people think this is hostile, and I would say probably a good portion of the audience will not perceive this as hostile. They'll say, I'm not sure why it's hostile. It's factual. The attorneys told us we should go over the details, but I would like to tell you I'm sure this is hostile, and I'll explain to you why. One thing we know is what can a person not do about the past? And the answer is they can't change it. And so if you go and run a list of prior events, simply emphasize the past, the way it feels for the employee is that you're just hitting them and hitting them and hitting them. And I would say by the time you hit the third one of these items, the person stops thinking about the issue and they think about how they'd like to strangle you. And let's talk about why. Because if you think about it, in essence, there's only two possible reactions they can have to this. One reaction is to get angry. And oftentimes they will talk about feeling picked on. Well, think about it. If they get angry, what happens to work for the day? Forget it, gone. Or the other option is they can get very depressed. If they get very depressed, what happens to work for the day? Gone. They go back to their desk and work is gone for the day. So either way, that creates an emotional reaction. So what I'm suggesting is that we don't want to dwell on the past. Now, clearly, you have to mention the past, because I'm not going to turn around to somebody and simply say you need to be on time, because the person's going to say to me, "Oh, why are you talking to me?" So I need to give them a reason. But I'm suggesting treading lightly. So I'll give you an example. I might turn around to a person and say, I'd like to discuss with you your pattern of lateness. By the way, I probably should back up and say, you shouldn't really even have this problem if you would have addressed the matter sooner. Oftentimes, when we let things build up because we don't want to address them until they become extreme, in other words, we won't address the first time they're late, but we wait till it's the fifth time, what we actually have the potential to do is to take a minor item and turn it into a big item. You always emphasize the emotion the longer you wait. So clearly we shouldn't even be in this position. But just to give you some justification how you might end up here, suppose you were new, without blaming you, suppose you were new, and you've now looked at the records and you're seeing this pattern, so you need to talk to this person about something that may even have happened before you began. So what you might do is say to the person something like this: I'd like to talk to you about your pattern of lateness. And then you stop. If the person doesn't deny it, they don't say, me, I'm never late, there's really no reason to go and lay out all of the details about all the past events. Now, just to address an issue that comes up from the attorneys, they will say, in order for you to do progressive discipline correctly, you need to document prior events with the employee, because someone will say, I was never told this was a problem. So I'll tell you how you can do that. You can have a list of all of the latenesses, and you're on a piece of paper, and you can turn around to the employee and say, I would like to talk to you about your pattern of lateness. You can hand them the list, and you can say, if you'd like to review them, they're here. That's okay to do. What you don't want to do is stand there with a list in your hand and read each item out. Because I'm telling you, by the time you get to item 4, the person just wants to kill you, and they've actually lost focus on the issue of their lateness. So you want to tread lightly on the past. Now, I'll tell you who does do this. And I think, by the way, a reason why I think a lot of supervisors get into this pattern is partly because they misinterpret what the attorneys ask them, but I also think it's because they watch too much Law and Order. And, and I'm actually serious about that. I think we use the wrong model. If I were a litigator and I had a witness on the witness stand and I could bring up something they'd done in the crib to impeach them, I would do it. But my goal there is to influence the jury. So I'll tell you how you can do that. You can have a list of all of the latenesses, and I could bring up something they'd done in the crib to impeach them, I would do it. But my goal there is to influence the jury. So if you get to the point where you're finally sitting at a hearing to have someone removed, absolutely, you're going to the hearing officers, you're going to really lay it on thick to drive home your point. But we need to remember that in this case, the employee is the audience. And so it's ineffective when we're trying to influence them. So if it's a third party, sure, lay it on thick. If it's the person, it's best to tread lightly on the past, to focus mostly on the future. And I remind people, you know, because some of this stuff is when you're under tension, you're going to fall into your old patterns, is to write down for themselves, hostile is past, assertive is future. Hostile is past, assertive is future. So think about that a little bit. No matter how calm the words are, if you're putting too much. And here's another point too. You know, if you really get a smarky employee, they can really turn this around on you. Also, I had one person tell me a story. He read out a list of all the lateness to an employee, and the employee said to me, "I have to disagree with you. According to my records, there was only 11 latenesses in the month of." And then that's when you realize this is ridiculous. Remember, whatever happened in the past, it's over. Okay, so we want to make sure that we're always emphasizing this is about next steps, what you do next time, in the future, from now on. So you try to stay, so you don't want to drive home the point too hard. What's the biggest problem potentially with hostile communications is that you can prompt such an emotional reaction that the employee now can play the victim. They'll go back to the whole department and say, "You victimized me," or they simply won't work for 2 days because they'll be in such a frazzle. And our goal really is to get people used to being able to take correction. Maybe they don't like it, but be able to go back to their work site, accept it. You know, they get some praise, they get some criticism. Neither one rocks their world. So again, and I'll tell you something else. You know, sometimes some of your difficult employees would love you to abuse them because they have a narrative. They try to get all the other employees to get, you know, this new person, they're out to get us. And so sometimes they'll even taunt you, and then when you react, you play right into their hands. They'll go and complain to their union, he said this. So what I try to emphasize in coaching supervisors is that hostile is weak. Assertive is strong, because hostile suggests that they've gotten so under your skin that you're emotionally, you know, you can't take it. And so to kind of use this graphic, you know, you're enraged, and it doesn't appear as strong. It actually appears weaker. So you want to appear, if you're feeling that way, that's because maybe something does upset you, it's probably best not to have that encounter until you're in a calm place and then kind of more focused. So, of course, that's hostile. And, of course, I always try to say to people, it's not for me to judge you. This is about self-reflection. But I think it's important to know a little bit about your own MO. And if you're a kind of a person, I'm going to back up on this one, and you kind of lean a little to the hostile side, it's good to know that and to learn how to manage it. I often say don't deny your emotions. If you deny your emotions, they'll run you over, you know, or they'll drive you. Understand them. If you know the kind of person, you're the kind of person where if something comes up and it upsets you, you're more likely to just react and don't have a meeting with them then. You know, put it off. These things are, most of these things, they are more long-term improvements. You wait, you do it the next day, you go back to your office, you write your bullet list. If your hand is shaking so hard you can't write your list, you're not in a good position to have a meeting with an employee. Be in a calm place, be in a better place, and then do it. But don't get angry at yourself for getting upset. Just learn to work with that. Okay, so that's kind of the one side of this, the Goldilocks and the three bears, too high. And what I've actually done is studied more about the impact of people who are too cold, or rather who don't react. And in fact, I see that as extremely problematic, and I'll share with you some examples of this. So the example with the passive person is they observe behaviors in an employee that upset them, and they don't say a word. Now, they don't say a word for a lot of reasons, usually because they're just not really comfortable in confronting, or they're worried about morale, or they're in some cases they're even afraid they'll mishandle it, so they don't say a word. But every time they see this reaction, they lose a little more enamel off their teeth, but they don't say a word. Okay? So what happens is they harbor rage from unresolved issues. And that rage has to go somewhere. And so I'm going to share with you where it goes. And I'm going to kind of describe it in terms of bad, worse, and worse than that. Okay, so let me start with kind of what bad would be. Okay, bad would be, and by the way, just a little qualification on passive individuals. Being passive doesn't necessarily mean being quiet. In fact, many of our chronic complainers are, in fact, passive individuals. Being passive is really about being non-confrontational. So if I have a problem with one person, I'll talk to 5 other people about it, but I won't go to the person I have the issue with. So frequently, by the way, the person who's going to sit in your staff meeting and not say a word, and then go back to the after the meeting is over and go back to the lounge and go gripe about how they don't like the system, that's frequently a passive individual. So what happens is sometimes what passive supervisors do is the first thing is they make their spouses miserable. Well, actually, can I back this up a minute and actually get to the question of this harboring of rage from unresolved issues? I often ask people if they are harboring rage from unresolved issues, and I'd like to give you a way of knowing whether you're doing that. So I'd like to suggest this. If you go home to your significant other on an occasion complaining about this or that situation that happened during the day, that is not rage. But if you find yourself going home almost every day to complain about the same situation, that is rage, and that's got to go somewhere. So the first place that I see that going is you make your spouse's life miserable complaining about that. But that isn't that's not so terrible because that's what spouses are for. But what I frequently find in addition to that is that the frustrated manager will also vent their frustration about an employee to other employees, and that's not appropriate. And, in fact, is very problematic because you kind of create this kind of an inside and outside crowd. And, in fact, sometimes what I would call the good child in this, kind of sibling relationship often feeds on this. The manager will vent to the good employees about the poor employees, and it can kind of create an inside and outside dynamic. And then what do you do when really the problem you have is with one of those people? So, and I'll tell you something else. It violates confidentiality. It's inappropriate for you to be discussing your dissatisfaction with one employee with another. So, and it's a common thing that passive supervisors do. They will end up, because they have such a need to talk about this, and they don't feel comfortable confronting the employee, so they talk about it to other employees. You're terrific, but if only we get this person, they're impossible, etc. Not appropriate to do. So let me stop for a minute and see if we have any questions, and then we'll continue.
If you have a question for Jeff, please hit 7# on your phone.
I'm going to take that as a no questions. Am I right, Matthew?
You are correct.
Okay, there we go. So we'll move on. So I went over just the first one, which is to you end up violating confidentiality. You talk to people you really shouldn't talk to about an employee. Let's talk about the second example that I see passive individuals doing, and that I describe as the straw that broke the camel's back. So a good example with that is maybe there's something that really upsets you. I could probably give you one more qualification on this issue of passive communicators. Unless you're pathologically passive, you're likely to address a serious transgression on the part of it. You will address a serious transgression. If an employee were explicitly rude to a customer, if an employee were violating, a really, really big rule, certainly an employee was coming in drunk, unless you're pathologically passive, you're going to address that. Those are not the things that you see in terms of passive communicators. What you usually see are the more lower level things. The person who's supposed to take a 15-minute break and typically takes a 20-minute break. Or someone who's supposed to get something in and it's supposed to be in by noontime, and they typically don't get it until 3 o'clock. Those are usually the things that certainly affect productivity, can affect productivity a lot, but those are the kind of things that supervisors who are passive tend to not want to address until it reaches an extreme, and that's what causes the rage. So and what I often try to say is that, and they'll try to hint at it sometimes, or they'll bring it up in a staff meeting. By the way, another bit of advice, if there's an issue that you have or a concern, unless it's a problem that is so prevailing across your whole department, I would recommend that you generally don't bring it up at a staff meeting. In other words, if there's something that's really being directed at one person, you need to address it to that person. If it's a matter that's, department-wide, then certainly it's okay to bring it up. And I'd rather that most of the meetings you're really focusing on what people do well, and that you use the opportunity to correct more in private. But what I find sometimes is that passive individuals, they're so uncomfortable directly confronting that what they'll try to do is talk it out to the whole group, because they don't have directed at any one person, and that actually alienates your good-performing employees. So if I have a concern with someone, I need to take it to them. But oftentimes this person doesn't do this. So what happens is the rage builds, and then all of a sudden, it's what I call the straw that broke the camel's back. All of a sudden you get a day that's hotter than usual, or we're tireder than usual, or it's just certain times of the year. I would say there are certain straw that broke the camel's back months in education. I would say December and, almost towards the end of the school year. And so let's say there's a situation here's another one that'll always set you off, having your boss notice it. So let me give you just a case in point. Let's say maybe there's an issue you have you've hinted at it at meetings rather than really address it for the people. People not really being at their desk or ready to work at the start of the workday. It's amazing how often I see people think that they can clock in, but they don't necessarily have to start work. So they clock in and they're warming up, but they're not actually at their work site at the time at the start of the day. So phones are ringing and there's no one there to really answer it. Calls are going to voicemail, not appropriate. We need people at the start of the workday is 8 o'clock. They need to be at their desk and ready to work at 8 o'clock. And I'll repeat that saying because you need to communicate well what your expectations are. I talk about being ready to work at the start of your shift. At your work site, ready to work at the start of your shift. Okay? So let's say that this is happening and people are not doing this, and then all of a sudden my boss goes by, the superintendent comes by and says, a lot of people are not at their desks. Well, that's usually enough to set me off. I've already been upset about this. Now it's been seen by my boss. Now it makes me look bad. So what do? I look for the first person who arrives. Now, they may not necessarily be the worst offender. They were just that unfortunate person that happened to cross my path just at the time that I was about to blow. And so all of a sudden, here I am. I'm the passive person. I don't like to be hostile. Don't want to be one of those kinds of manager. And the moment I totally blow up, I explode on them. I yell and scream at them. I read them the riot act. That's what I do because all those emotions flood out. Now, now you can understand why that happens. It's all been built up. It's pent up. But let's see how that employee interprets it. Every day, they've been coming by, arriving at their desk at 8:10. They see me. I say good morning. I don't say a word to them. They assume, what? It's fine. And then all of a sudden, on September 6th, 8 a.m. in the morning, I get a boss reading me the riot act. So what am I likely to think? Am I going to think that it's my behavior or that the boss is having an off day? So most of the time, the employee interprets it as, I guess my boss didn't take his meds this morning, or I've heard worse. But in other words, they're going to probably attribute it to you being in an off mood, and it's going to be totally ineffective in terms of message. Now let's see how I interpret it. Here I am. I'm the kind of person so conscious about not wanting to, be hostile that I almost swing the pendulum too far the other way. And now because all these emotions flood out, my emotional side took over, I totally blow up on the employee. Well, when I calm down and I reflect on my practice, I'm usually going to be, based on the kind of person that I am, I'm going to be horrified by that. And I'm going to feel bad about that. So I may go back to the employee and apologize to them for having, and so where are we on the issue? Nowhere. And then let's look at what else happens in that case. Oftentimes when that happens, by the way, if I'm lucky, that's all that happens. it's quite possible that the employee at that moment goes and files an EEOC case, and I've got my boss coming to me and telling me that I need to leverage our employee assistance program to deal with my anger management problem. Here I am, the passive person, and I've got to, I'm being told I need to deal with my anger. So what often happens in those situations is the manager, the passive person who's blown up like that will say, I felt like I was a failure. I need to be better. What I'm going to do is I'm going to hold it in better. I'm going to work on holding it in the next time. I lost my self-control. Well, I'm going to tell you, if you do that, you set yourself up for even a bigger disaster next time. All you're going to do is blow bigger. So a very common characteristic with a passive communicator is they go through these patterns of no reaction and then occasional explosions. So I often ask a group, this is not a group that gives me many responses, but I often ask a group, if I can get them to raise their hands, I'll say, how many of you have had a boss who blew hot and cold? One day you did something and it was fine, the next day you got your head cut off. And typically I'll have people say that, they've experienced that sometime in their career. And then I'll ask the question, well, what kind of supervisors blow hot and cold? Are they hostile supervisors or passive supervisors? When we look at it, we realize it's the passive ones. Hostiles blow hot all the time. And believe it or not, people can get used to that. After a while, you kind of just get a little numb to that. And it doesn't, and you kind of get leathered up a little bit. But it's the passive supervisor that totally rocks your world because you don't know what the expectations are. All of a sudden you thought it was fine, and now you read the Riot Act. In fact, I'll kind of share with you a piece of information. The number one cause of stress on the job is not the volume of work. It's role ambiguity. It's not knowing what a good job is. And so if I am all of a sudden I'm doing something and I think it's fine with my boss because I never heard a word about it, and then like I say on September 6th I've got somebody going and screaming at me, then I'm beginning to think, I don't know what's going on, and that causes me greater stress. So one of our goals is it's better to be as direct and regular with people than to be just periodically explosive over rage. But that's a common characteristic with passive. Calm and then occasional explosions. And at this point, I didn't go over the third one yet. I'm going to take a kind of a little bit step forward on the slide, talk to you about an idea, and then I'm going to come back and share the third example. But this one about straw that broke the camel's back kind of fits well into this. So if I can find it, hold on. Actually, one more, and then I'll back up. Okay, I want to talk to you about this concept of the difference between a rule and a norm. Now, I think you all know what a rule is. Obviously, the rule is whatever, and by the way, this is interesting because this actually has to do with not so much the behavior of the difficult employees, but actually the kind of behaviors that we end up, by the way we supervise, and creating with all employees. So let me talk to you about the difference between a rule and a norm. I think you all know what a rule is. Obviously, the rule is whatever's in the contract. It's whatever is, whatever's, in the handbook, whatever's been written policy. So what's the norm? The norm's the real deal. It's the real rule, okay? And even as young children, one of the things that we learn very early on is that there's a little bit difference between the real rules and the norms. So I'd like to give you an example outside of work, and then I'll bring it back as a parallel. I don't know where people are from, so I'm going to assume we'll use New York ASBO as an example. I'll often ask, what's the speed limit on the thruway or on the Northway? And people will go, well, depending on the section, it's 65. So I say you go 70, you get a ticket. I go, no, not really. Or you go 75, you get a ticket? Maybe. Over 75, good bet you're going to get a ticket. So what I'd like to suggest to you is that's the difference between a rule and a norm. The rule is the speed limit, which is 65. The norm is, as long as you don't go over 75, you're probably on a safe bet. So the first question becomes what conditions do you need to have a difference between a rule and a norm? And I'd like to suggest to you there's certain characteristics that have direct parallels to the work site. So let me give you those. The first is, if you're ever going to have a difference between a rule and a norm, there has to be something in it for people. In other words, people don't just break rules for the sake of breaking them. I mean, there's an occasional person that does that, but then they're just oppositionally defiant. most people break a rule for a pragmatic reason because they get some inherent benefit from breaking the rules. So why do people speed? Clearly they speed because it gets them something that for all of us is a limitation in life. They get time. So they have an inherent benefit in speeding. So first you have to have that inherent benefit. The second condition that you need to have a difference between a rule and a norm is the penalty for breaking the rule can't be all that severe. So, for example, if the penalty for speeding were execution, I can have a best bet we wouldn't have a lot of people taking a chance. So those are the first two conditions. And what you're going to find is that different people have different levels of risk aversion. So, for example, there are people, they will go on vacation, grab a rent-a-car out of an airport, immediately go 10 miles over the speed limit. There are other people, a little more cautious. They'll turn around, they'll, kind of start the speed limit, but if they're watching all the other cars go faster, eventually they will get up to whatever that norm is that, that we all kind of know is that hinted 10 miles above the speed limit. So here's the question. This is kind of the provocative. Well, first of all, how do we learn the norms? Well, we learn them actually from experience. We either learn them from our own experience or we learn them from others. I can tell you how I learn it. I'm driving, I'm driving on the throughway, and I'm doing maybe 75, I'll admit it, and all of a sudden I'm about to hit an underpass, an overpass, and I spot the state trooper just at that, kind of honing off in a corner. And I drive a stick shift, so I downshift, and I swing by him at about, 73 miles an hour, and I don't know about you, but I always look in my rearview mirror, and I look to see if his lights have gone on. I'm also thinking, do I have my up-to-date insurance card? And if the lights don't go on, I conclude, well, I didn't hit that limit. So you learn the norm by your experience. And I can also learn it by going at 55 or 65 and watching a lot of other cars go faster and not seeing them get pulled over unless they go really fast. So they're in a very red car, sports car. We always think they get nabbed more. But yeah, I think you all understand what I mean. We kind of get a sense of where that acceptable speed is. So here's the provocative question. Who determines the norm? We're going to try to see if I can get some response from people. They can do chat comments, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, so I'd like people to adjust chat. This is the way I can tell you're awake. Okay? How many of you think the drivers determine the norm? And just type in the word drivers. How many of you think the police determine the norm? Are we getting any responses?
You can't see the chat window?
I can't see it, no.
We have one for police and one for drivers.
Okay, one for police. And a lot of other people said, I attended this webinar, but I'm not commenting. Okay, that's fine. Well, let me tell you what the answer is. The answer is the drivers. The police. Drivers do a normal behavior in response to a rule under these conditions, which is that they stretch it. But it's the police that determine the norm, because the norm is determined by the threshold at which the lights go on. So you go 70, they don't flip the light. You go over 75, they flip the light. So in effect, the norm is determined by the enforcer. So why is this significant in terms of a good and important lesson for us? If I have an employee and they're 5 minutes late to work, or they are 5 minutes, they have a 15-minute break, and instead they're taking 20 minutes, and I won't address that. But once they hit 25 minutes, I will, then eventually I'll get almost everybody at close to 25. So anytime you say, I don't really want to address a matter until it kind of like it builds up, you're in effect creating a norm. And so, of course, if you think this doesn't matter, sometimes this can actually be more of an impact on productivity than the behavior of one difficult employee. And I'll just give you a hypothetical to make the point. I'll use some numbers. I'm going to take out my little pad and do a little calculations and I'll describe them to you. Let's assume that we'll make the numbers easy. Let's assume we have 10 employees, okay? So it's just for simplicity, okay? We have 10 employees, and let's assume that on average, in the morning when they arrive, they take about 5 minutes to get, after they clock in, to really get to work. So that's 5 minutes. Let's assume that typically they're supposed to get a 15-minute break, but that ends up really being a, 20-minute break on average, And then lunch is supposed to be 45 minutes, but it's really closer to 50 minutes. There's a break in the afternoon. So we got another one. I'm not even going to include the winding up at the end of the day. We'll leave that one now off. So just the way I described that, which I think most people would say is certainly not all that unusual. Okay, that's 20 minutes. 5 minutes in the morning, 5 minutes morning break, 5 minutes at lunch, 5 minutes in the afternoon break. That's 20 minutes. 20 minutes times 10 employees is 200 minutes a day times 5 days is 1,000 minutes. Okay? So you start adding that up. You know that extra part-time person, that FTE you wanted, half-time FTE, you have it. Time is time. So these things do matter. So I'm not suggesting you should just address anything just for the sake of addressing it. In fact, my recommendation with respect to rules and norms is that you do the following. You think about what are the difference between your rules and your norms. Write them down for yourself. What are those differences? And then take a look at that list, because I don't suggest you take all of them on. You want to take on the ones that matter to you. And in fact, I would even give you some suggestions on which ones to tackle first, because I will tell you, you do get a momentum. If you take on a few, people will kind of get the pattern here. But you want to be selfish about this. There are a lot of things that are differences. They're not a high priority. So I would just suggest to you, here's a good, kind of thing to think about. Is it creating a safety hazard? Is it leaving us legally exposed? Is it creating a negative perception with customers? Is it creating a negative perception with higher-ups? And is it limiting efficiency? Now, I have to admit, I put efficiency as the least highest on this list. But I tell you, this is my view on what you should tackle. But certainly if we have things where people are creating a legal exposure, making us look bad, we need to probably address them right away. Okay, and then I'm going to give you some advice on how to address it. Because here's the thing, these differences in rules and norms exist already. So you've got to decide what you're going to do at this point. Okay, and so here's what I would suggest you do. The first thing is you pick one of them, because people can only change so many things. I think a problem I sometimes see is someone coming into a meeting and they've got 12 things to go over. Not a good idea. And in fact, I was just working with the district a couple of weeks ago. We had the whole district administrative team, and we actually sat down and decided what was the one rule versus norm, rule tightening we wanted to do, one for the next 2 months. Only one that everybody would do organization-wide. Now, I don't think you have to do it organization-wide just to make it work, but that was just an example of how you take the approach slow. You don't necessarily, even though I would like you to know all your differences between your rules and your norms, because I think that's that's certainly a good, important framework for a new supervisor, or even somebody who's been around for a while, that kind of reflection. But I think at that point what you want to do is just take on one. And I'll tell you exactly how you do this. I kind of learned this from my experience when I was doing this work with the U.S. Postal Service. And I could do an hour on talking about the Postal Service, but I won't do that here. But what you want to do is you want to have a meeting with your staff, and you want to basically tell them the deal is off. Whatever was done in the past, the deal was off. Now, when you do that, you can either be honest or dishonest. So I'm going to give you both. I'll probably give you dishonest first, okay? It's not entirely dishonest, but one way you could approach it is to say, due to the new cap, or due to the new financial pressures, or due to new state regulations. In other words, blame the change on an outside factor. Our board is much tighter on this, our new superintendent. So you say, the reason why I'm changing something that's been already the custom is because of some sort of an external factor. That's one reason. The second thing, which I think is more honest, which is fine, is to say, to be honest, I haven't focused enough on it. It's been a concern for me for a while, but I've been busy with other things. I haven't addressed it. So you blame you. So you either say it's an outside factor or you blame you. The key is you don't blame them. Because if you blame them, you'd be dwelling on the past. And the key here is nothing about the past. If you don't blame them, you avoid all of these kinds of responses. Well, our previous boss let us do this. No one ever told me this was wrong. I thought you were fine with it. By not blaming them, you take all of that out. They say, we've always been doing that way. You go, absolutely. They go, well, I've been doing it for a while. You never complained before. You say, absolutely. Not an issue. What I'm telling you is from this point on, as of tomorrow, no more. So you definitely do not want to blame them or focus on the past. You want to focus on the future. Now, when you do that, the question is, are they going to believe you? Well, to be honest, some do. Generally, when people have a meeting like this, usually get some tightening among some employees. But I can guarantee you that there are some people that are not going to believe you because they've seen this pattern before. The boss coming forward all enraged over an issue, this has to end from now, and then the following day it's business as usual. So I can guarantee that the next day your risk takers, your challengers, are going to just test the system. So I would give you some thought about this. You need to think about when you're going to the timing of this meeting. So, for example, I would not have a meeting like this the day before the opening of school, because I know that the day of the opening of school, I'm going to be busy with other things. I'm not going to be around to be able to watch to see what time people came in. Or I'm not going to have this meeting before if I know the next day I'm going to be out at a conference. In other words, as you plan these meetings, the critical next step is the direct, specific monitoring immediately after. So I say, if you've lived with this for this long, wait another day, plan it at a time when you have the time to then check to actually see how people are doing, to monitor it, and then you want to address it. Okay, and what you're going to find is, maybe the first time some of these people come in, to use the hypothetical I used on time, the first time they come in late, I'll politely remind them that I was serious about this, and maybe the second time not be as polite, and I will eventually get everybody to tighten up on this. Now, what you're going to find is, if you do one of these or two of these, by the time you get to the third one, you won't have to go through as long a process. People can understand predictable reactions. They know the meeting's coming. They know the follow-up's going to come. They know it's tightening up, and so they give it up. So what I've heard from supervisors who take this approach is that they gain momentum, and they don't necessarily need to have to go through the critical process and steps. And that's why I would make one more suggestion. In addition to all the other lists of priorities, I'll step back to my list again just so you can see it. Here's another one. Try to pick something in the beginning that you know is very easy to monitor, something that there's not a lot of subjectivity in the contract. I always like things having to do with time because a clock is a clock. If it has to do with quality of work, a little bit more challenging, so I'll tend to try to do those first. Not that you can't tackle those things, but I'm telling you, if you can't talk to somebody about the fact that they're taking too long on a break, I don't know how you're going to talk to them about the quality of their work. And that's how you tighten things up. And since we're talking about an impact across the whole operations versus one difficult employee, often the benefits from tightening a rule or a norm in terms of overall productivity and visible improvement from the outside can actually be more dramatic even than working on one difficult employee. Not that you shouldn't work on difficult employees, but that, looking at rules and norms is very important. So I'm going to kind of back up and go back to a couple slides and go back to this issue of I told you there was that third example, so I'll just to summarize again. So there was the, violating kind of the rules by sharing stuff with other people that I shouldn't. There was a straw that broke the camel's back. And then the third one that I've seen some passive supervisors do is to try to get even with the person in some sneaky, manipulative, underhanded way, passive-aggressive. So I think we all know what passive-aggressive is. It's when an example of passive-aggressive might be I'm really angry at somebody, so they get the worst possible schedule, or they wanted a green pad, so we intentionally buy a blue one. Just things that we do to try to taunt them. And I would suggest it's not a very good practice, because here's what happens. Whenever you do Passive-aggressive behavior, most of the time the person can spot it. They know what you're doing. They know why you're doing it in spite of the fact that you deny it. And it only tends to make very creative people think of a way they can torture you passive-aggressively. So you kind of open the door to making that part of the culture. You don't want to do it. And if you find that you've done it in the past, it's often the sign of your frustration in not addressing issues directly. So you need to do that. Okay, I mean, and I have to tell you, most people who are not assertive, I understand that it's uncomfortable for them. And so the first time you do it, especially if you're dealing with a really difficult employee, it's not going to be an easy thing for you. But so you're going to gulp, going to get through it. You're going to feel much better and stronger as a leader if you do it. And what I want to try to do is give you some of the tools to help you. But I'm going to tell you, all the tools in the world, like trying to drive a car. You know, you can read a manual 40 pages long. You're not really going to learn how to drive a car until you get behind the wheel. So, and one of the things is, again, is you got to address it now. Don't wait for, the annual review is coming up in a month. People should never walk into an annual review not knowing what the story is and be taken aback. It should always be, the summative of what they already know. So you need to not let things build up. You need to really address them right away. Okay, let's just talk quickly about assertive. What is assertive? Simple idea, detached, unemotional, results-oriented, and focused on the future. What do I mean by detached and unemotional? It's not about them. It's about the thing. It's not an issue whether I like them or not. It's this thing I want them to do or not to do. And it's results-oriented. I'm thinking about something that really affects work. And it's focused on the future. And so the simplest idea in terms of an assertive statement is, I'll give you two of them, okay, because one's a little bit more polite and the other's more directive. But I would suggest that this should be the beginning of your sentences. Okay, in the future, I would appreciate it if. And the more directive would be, in the future, I'd expect that. Now, it doesn't have to exactly be in the future. It could be from next time, from this point on. But I think it's important to emphasize that you're not talking about what happened before. You're talking about what you want to see from that point on. And what you want to do is ask for these things in a way that indicates your confidence in the ability of the employee to do it. So you don't want to say something like, in the future, I appreciate it if, or else. That's not effective. You want to ask for it. You want to get an assent from them. So could I expect that in the future you'll be on time, you'll be at your work site at 8 o'clock? I want them to say yes. We want to move on. Okay? That's the goal. Now, so you want to, planning is really important. And control of the meetings are important. I'm going to tell you a little secret. One of the ways that difficult employees manipulate their bosses is that they drag the meetings on. One advantage that they have over you is time. You're busy. They have all the time in the world. So what they'll often do is it feels like trying to nail Jell-O to a wall. So every time you have a meeting with them, they bring up other extraneous matters. The meetings drag on for a really long time, and then eventually the supervisor just says, I can't take it anymore, and they move on. They ignore the employee. They do the work for them. They give it to somebody else. So the difficult employee will sometimes, their best strategy to just make you crazy is to just not get to the point, okay? So you need a way to get control of your meetings, okay? And so again, this is a webinar, so we're going to keep it to kind of short and brief, and I go and usually do some role plays on this when we do the longer training. But here's just to give you some basic tips. Here's the key to getting the end of your meeting. You need to pose it as a question. You need to say to the employee, so, can I expect that you're going to be on time from now on? You pose it as a question, because they'll often bring up things. They'll say things like, well, why are you asking me and not him, or my back hurts, or the traffic, or, So, most people put up with a little bit of that, but at some point you need to bring it to closure. And the way you bring it to closure is you say, so, can I expect that in the future you're going to be on time, or from tomorrow you're going to be on time from now on? And if the employee says yes, the meeting's over. If the employee says no, the meeting's over. Now, what happens if they say no? Well, you're going to need to go to a next step. And I'm not going to go into a lot of details about those next steps today, but just let's just suggest that what you need to do at that point is don't run to bring their union in or or your superintendent or your HR director in at this point if you have one. Because I'm telling you, a lot of people at that moment are going to say no because they're just emotionally hijacked. They're seeing red. So I usually let it marinate a little bit. You know, if they were, I won't do that, I refuse, I'll usually say something like, now you realize that by refusing that would be tantamount to insubordination. They go, I'm not doing it, I let it go, and I give it about an hour or two. I usually sometimes give it until the next day because sometimes I think they need to get the wife or the husband to go hit them over the head and say, what, are you crazy? And then most of the time they come back with their tail between their legs or something equivalent to that and say, okay, I didn't agree with you, but I'll do that. And that's okay. So, and this way I don't waste anyone else's time. So don't run, you know, right after the meeting when they refuse. But generally the way out of your meetings is to pose it as a question. Okay, that's really the secret weapon. So you frame it in terms of a next step, you pose it as a question. One of the keys with assertiveness is sufficiency. Just enough to get your message across, not enough to prompt an emotional reaction. And so the key here, the simplest idea is shorter the better. Get in and get out of your meetings. Most of these encounters should be 5 minutes. If you have a meeting that's dragging on for half an hour, you're not in control of that meeting. The employee is. Unless you've gotten past that, yes, you're going over the details of something procedurally. But if you're really getting to the issue, it should be 5 minutes. Quick, in and out. You know, before either you can lose your cool or they can lose their cool. And so one of the things we do when we do role-playing with this is we'll decide in advance how long a meeting should take. And if it turns out to drag on longer, we ask what happened. Was I really running the meeting, or were they running it? This is a good reflective thing for you. If you're finding when you have a meeting with a particular employee, the meetings drag on, ask yourself, how is that person gaining control? Am I letting them? And then that's something you can work on as a skill. By the way, the beautiful thing about this stuff is you get another bite at the apple. You can afford to not do it perfectly. You can do it the next time a little bit better. It's a practice skill. You get better with time. So forgive yourself if you've made some mistakes when you had an encounter. You can always have a next time. None of this stuff is fatal. But it's a good way to get better and improve over time. Okay. Sometimes supervisors say they don't want to address an issue because they're worried about damaging morale. So I want you to think about this. What do you think is the number, and I know I've gotten a lot of feedback from people, so I have to ask and answer my own questions here, but what do you think is the number one complaint that good performing employees have about a supervisor? So I'm gonna answer you. I'm gonna answer that, and I would say that my reaction has been from employees is that they don't slay the dragon. They resent the fact that other employees have been allowed to get away with things, and they then resent it. And in fact, sometimes that resentment can get so strong that employees will actually take the matter into their own hands, and that is potentially problematic, extremely problematic, because what I'll accept from a supervisor I won't accept from a coworker, and all of a sudden you really damage the ability of a team to work together for years on end after that, or for certainly a while after that. So why am I bringing this up? Because there is no fence. If you don't address your poor performers, you will generate, whether it's expressed or not, resentment on your best performing employees. They will resent you. And if you address poor performance, your poor performers will be annoyed at you. So you have to ask yourself the question, who do you want to be annoyed with you? I'd rather that my poor performers were annoyed with you. And that's the reason why I really do need to address these things. I'm just going to kind of skip a little bit because I'm going to leave at least about 5 minutes for questions if we have any at the end. And I want to kind of just go run through my summary. But I'm just going to suggest to you that change will not happen if you don't have pressure for the change. So I'm just going to skip a few slides. We'll go towards, I want to do like a summary of some of the techniques and strategies. Okay, here's the basic summary for addressing issues with an employee. And again, it's just a way for me to summarize some of these things. Number one, keep it short, okay? Focus on expectations for the future. Express positive expectations. Much more better to say to an employee, I need you to be on time than don't be late. Consider the venue. I'm just going to take a minute to talk about venue. Venue is location. You know, one of the things that I've been trying to emphasize is how important it is to try to keep meetings short and maybe maybe even, in this concept of sufficiency with assertiveness, maybe not a lot of words, because to a certain extent these meetings are all about drama, the intensity of drama, how annoyed I am at a behavior, and how do I get that communicated to an employee in a respectful way. So one thing that I see some supervisors do that I think is really clever is that they will establish 3 different venues and use them consistently. So an example would be this. If it's a minor matter that an employee is doing, just a kind of a minor correct, I'll catch them at their work site. It'll be a little tap on the shoulder. If the matter's a little bit more serious, I'll have a behind-the-door frame conversation in my office, both of us standing but behind the door frame. If it's a more serious matter, then I'll ask them to sit down. Now, if you do that consistently, and you have a serious matter, and you say to somebody, have a seat, think about all the words you won't have to use. Just the very fact that you ask them to have a seat will already place you in that position in terms of drama. And that will allow you to save having to say things that you wish you hadn't. It'll avoid a lot of time in the meeting, which is an efficiency issue. So think about being consistent about your venues. Really good managers do that. They will never address a serious matter, a minor matter, by asking a person to sit down. Okay? A couple of other things. Address only one matter at a time, which doesn't necessarily mean that I couldn't take on more than one thing at a meeting. Normally what I tell people is, you can do up to 3, but 3 is a lot, never more than 3. So what I'll do is I'll make my bullet list of my 3 items that concern me. And I'll start with the first one. We'll go over it. If I feel like it went out, and I'll always conclude it with, so can we expect that in the future you will? And the employee says yes. And then what I do is I do what I call a wigging check. Do I feel like I'm about to strangle them? Do they look like they're about to wig out on me? If they are, I end it. If I feel like it's been going well, then I might go on to the next matter. Once I address a matter, I'm not going to go back. Okay? So that's how I know I've concluded the matter. I've gotten the yes. And by the way, I'll take just a minute to go over what you need in terms of a counseling memo and how you document. Okay? You want to offer support, but don't take on the employee's monkey. So an example of that would be you have an issue with an employee being late, and they turn around, they're telling you, and again, I'm assuming this has not been chronic, it's an acute situation. The employee tells you, I'm having some babysitting problems. You say, I'll see what we can try to do. Maybe we can move you on flex time, or we can work things out. Well, sometimes we're not able to do those things. So I have to be careful about offering some solutions I can't do. So what I'll often say to the employee is, I'll talk to HR, see if we can move your hours up, but in the meantime, but it may not be possible, so in the meantime, I'll give you till Friday to work it out. So I never own it. It's amazing how sometimes employees take on, they'll take on the employee's monkey without meaning to, okay? And then plan a follow-up. I'll just give you one more last advice, and then we'll take a couple of questions, okay? And that is, do not warm up. And what I mean by that is I've seen this sometimes, especially passive supervisors, they'll turn around to somebody and they'll say, you're one of my most valuable employees, integral part of my team, and the employee's just waiting for the butt. Don't do that. First of all, it doesn't really cushion the employee's blow. The longer you do the warm-up, the more anxious they get. In fact, the longer you do it, the more they figure it must be a terrible thing that you did. It doesn't calm them down, and they don't interpret it as it was intended to calm them down. They interpret it as your wimpiness. My view is you've got to go right to the point. You say, the following has come to my attention, or I have a concern about something. You go right to the point. The worst part of a meeting should be the very beginning. The time to heal someone is at the end. You can turn around at the end of a meeting and say to someone, after they've agreed to yes, you say, don't think I don't appreciate all the things that you do. I know that I can really count on you for this or that. That's the time when the employee is at their low point, you can really build them up. Now, here's an interesting thing, and this is where we'll wrap up. Sometimes you can't say anything nice about it, because frankly, they would know that you don't mean it. And so to compliment them at the end, they would see that as phony and it's not effective. So what can you do in lieu of that if you really can't do that? What you can do is change the subject. So after you've done the matter, you say, by the way, did you happen to catch the game last night? Or how's your kid doing at college? Just the kind of conversation you might have with them if you'd never had an issue. And that's basically what you're telling them is, we're good. Well, I'm going to wrap up at this point on the topic. I've set aside about 5 minutes or so for any questions. We'll see if we have any, actually about 3 minutes, and then we'll call this a day.
Okay. If anyone has any questions for Jeff, please hit 7# on your phone or type it in the chat. Once again, any questions for Jeff, please hit 7# or type in the chat window.
I gather we don't have a lot of questions.
Nothing on my end here.
Okay, so you know what I like to say is this is never, sometimes you need to reflect on stuff for a while. I'm always available. You can certainly forward a question. I think there was a web address, too, that was given to people. So if you have some sort of a thought after the fact, I can guarantee you that we'll get you an answer. And I want to thank you for your time today, and I hope you found this to be useful. And good luck.
Yes, thank you on behalf of ASBO for coming today. If you are a registrant of the online course, the next session is September 12th at the same time, 2 p.m. That's on practical strategies for managing employees. And the third in this series is on September 19th as well. If you have any questions for Jeff or any questions or comments for me, please email me at mdarius@nysasbo.org. Jeff, thank you very much. Everyone, have a great day.
Safe trip home.